I don't usually make reviews. I've done one before, but generally I just speak my mind about stuff that comes to mind. But in this case, that actually overlaps with doing a review, because I just watched the first episode of Game of Thrones Season 8. And I have some thoughts about it, and I'm basically using it to give a little rant about the entire show. So, small warning, there will be a few spoilers, no big ones. I'm not going to discuss anything in depth, but if you haven't seen it and you want to go in completely blind, then this will be your warning. Stop watching right now. I was very excited for this season, despite not really liking last season, because I was like, yeah, they've got a lot more budget, fewer episodes, so it's just going to be a hell of a ride. Like, it will be flawed, but it's going to be a hell of a ride. And I must admit, I was a little disappointed. And I'm going to use this episode basically as an excuse to give a little rant about my thoughts about the series in general. Originally, Game of Thrones was a brilliant deconstruction of the fantasy genre. In normal fantasy, like Lord of the Rings, heroes fight their way out of unwinnable situations, and they take the moral high ground without paying much for it. Like, if they will make honorable decisions, even if they aren't the most wise, and they will manage, they will get out on top. In Game of Thrones, at least in early Game of Thrones, if you got yourself into an unwinnable situation, you lost. And if you made a stupid decision because it was more just, then you would die. And that made the entire show incredibly exciting, because you had no idea what was gonna happen next. Like, I know it has that reputation now, but back in the first season, I actually thought Ed was the main character, and I was like, nah, he's not gonna die. But he did, and it blew my mind. A large criticism people have had against the first few seasons was that everything happened rather slowly. And that's true, things were a little slow. And I know people who got turned off by that, who didn't watch through it. And I guess that makes sense, that's understandable, because the episodes are long. But that also had the added benefit of making the entire world feel very big. Like, moving from one side to the other side of the continent actually took episodes, or even seasons. Which might not be very exciting, but it did make you feel like, oh, this is an actual large fantasy world. Later in the season, things happened a bit faster, but that was okay, because we still held on to the core values that I mentioned earlier, about like undermining the general fantasy tropes. However, once we ran out of books, things went a little downhill. They were still exciting, there was a lot of cool effects, cool battles, cool concepts, but it kind of became a normal fantasy with the very tropes it undermined in earlier seasons. Like, if you take, for example, the battle in the north at the end of last season, where Jon and friends fight the White Walkers, in earlier seasons, that would be it. He would die, because there is no realistic way he would survive. Not to mention that they wouldn't have gone up there anyway, because that was a really forced way to manufacture conflict and spectacle, because that was just stupid. But he survived, and it kind of took away tension, because now I know Jon won't die until the plot wants him to die. And I guess that's always the case, like the plot decides what happens, but in earlier seasons at least it felt like, oh, if he makes a stupid decision, if he does something too risky, he will die. That's not the case anymore. He will only die once it's convenient for the plot, if it's convenient for the plot. The world doesn't feel big anymore either. People just teleport all over the place. That was a big criticism of last season. That hasn't really occurred this episode yet, but give it time. I must admit, my expectations weren't the highest for this season. I did not expect, or I still don't expect, good dialogue. And the introduction Marvel-style quippy joking between Varys and Tyrion at the start of this episode made that perfectly clear. There was no reason for them to have that exchange other than to give us some jokes and to show us that, haha, he's still the funny, quippy, offensive dwarf. I did not expect great or smart story either. And the conflict that seems to be going on between Jon, Sansa and Arya made that clear as well. Don't get me wrong, the conflict makes sense in the story, but it's unwelcome because there's no time to properly flesh it out. So it will inevitably be resolved with some emotional moment where everyone gains everyone's respect. And again, like, the conflict makes sense, but don't put it in there if you can't, like, conclude it properly. And I'd be very surprised if they can in this case. What I did expect was a lot of spectacle and efficient use of time, because they have fewer episodes. The spectacle did not yet deliver this episode, but it's the first episode. Like, that's not that big a deal. They have plenty of time for that. And let's be fair, I believe almost every episode, first episode of a season, was not that spectacular. I'm more disappointed by their inefficient use of time. I mean, do we really need a 10-minute long How to Train Your Dragon Avatar-style romantic flying scene between Danny and John, and to finish it up with some, like, Star Wars prequel level romantic dialogue between them, because that really cringed me out. Like, oh, we can stay here for 1,000 years and nobody would find us. Like, do we really need that right now? Because maybe other people disagree, but I definitely don't need that. And on that note, now that we're talking about Danny anyway, I'm not a big fan of the strong, air quotes, strong female characters in this show. Not because they're female, mind you. I have no problem with strong female characters. But my problem with them, and mostly Sansa and Danny, is that they tell us they are strong instead of showing us. Arya suddenly calls Sansa one of the most clever people she ever met in this episode. What? Why? Like, where does that come from? Like, first of all, Arya has almost no knowledge of what happened to Sansa for the past few years. I mean, I guess she could have told her, but she wasn't there to see it, so... I mean, Sansa has suffered a lot, that's for sure, but she did very little of her own. At one point she did start to become, like, clever, but then she got sold off to Ramsay, and she was his torture victim for a season. Like, how is she the cleverest person Arya has ever met? She's not even the cleverest person in the castle. Danny has that same problem, by the way. Everyone props her up like the second coming of Christ. But if you actually just look at what she did and not what people say about her, it's a very mixed bag. She's done some smart things, but she's done a lot of stupid shit as well, because she got blinded by her own morals. Morals which are very questionable, by the way. I read an interesting article lately about war crimes in Game of Thrones, and she is by far on top. And it's fine. Like, flawed characters can be strong, and they can be good characters. But don't pretend like she is Jesus. And by God, if I have to hear another rousing speech about breaking chains or wheels or whatever, I'm going to kill myself. Anyway, yeah, there was a bit of an unstructured rant, but I hope I made myself clear. And I don't hate the show. I think it's a great show. Even in its current form, it's one of the best shows on TV. But it started off so much better than it is right now. It used to be equal or arguably even superior to Breaking Bad, and it's kind of heartbreaking to see the quality go down season by season. I'm so excited to see how it ends, I really am. But I know they're making spin-off series, and if the last few seasons of Game of Thrones, where they didn't have the books to go by, if that is any prediction for the quality of the spin-off series, I might have to give those a pass. And I hate to say that, because I'm really excited also to see more of this universe. It's such a rich universe. Even in the books, I'm like, there are places there I wish we knew more about. There's some very weird shit in the East going on, and I wish I could see that. But the way they're doing it right now, it's a little disappointing.